From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Make no mistake, Hamas is pleased with the results from yesterday. I asked my colleagues here in the Security Council, who among us would accept this type of activity on your border? No one would. No country in this chamber would act with more restraint than Israel has.
The United States is refusing to criticize Israel after Israeli forces shot dead at least 60 unarmed Palestinian protesters in Gaza Monday, injuring 2,700. We'll speak to Norman Finkelstein, author of Gaza, an inquest into its martyrdom. Then Gina Haspel moves closer to becoming the next head of the CIA after 5 Democrats announced support for her despite her role in the U.S. torture program and her refusal to describe torture as immoral.
Do you believe the previous interrogation techniques were immoral? I'm not asking, do you believe they were legal? I'm asking, do you believe they were immoral?
Senator, I believe that CIA did extraordinary work to prevent another attack on this country, given the legal tools that we were authorized to use.
Please answer.
Plus, we'll look at a nationwide right-wing effort to persuade union members to quit and stop paying dues. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Israeli military shot dead at least one more Palestinian in Gaza Tuesday, only one day after the Israeli military massacred at least 61 unarmed Palestinians, wounding 2,700 more in that single day for protesting against the Israeli occupation and the opening of the new U.S. embassy in Jerusalem. The United States is refusing to criticize Israel after the massacre. At the United Nations, U.S. Ambassador Nikki Haley has blocked a call for an international investigation into Israel's actions. On Tuesday, Haley repeatedly blamed the violence on Hamas while praising Israel for showing restraint.
I asked my colleagues here in the Security Council, who among us would accept this type of activity on your border? No one would. No country in this chamber would act with more restraint than Israel has.
That was U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley. She later walked out of the Security Council chamber when the Palestinian ambassador to the UN, Riyad Mansour, addressed the council. Meanwhile, hospitals in Gaza are continuing to struggle to deal with the thousands of patients who were wounded by the Israeli military on Monday and Tuesday. This is Ayman al-Sabani, the director of the emergency room at Shifa Hospital.
The emergency department at Shifa Medical Center received the biggest number of these injuries. We received almost 500 injuries, while the capacity of the emergency department is 20 beds or 20 injuries. We are talking about 25 times as much about the capacity of the emergency department, with all the big challenges and the shortage in medicine and the medical supplies that reach critical levels.
In the last 6 weeks of nonviolent protests, the Israeli military has killed over 100 Palestinians, wounding over 12,000. We'll have more on Israel, Gaza, and the U.S. response after headlines. President Trump's nominee for CIA Director Gina Haspel appears to have won enough backing to be confirmed by the full Senate after Haspel came out saying the CIA should never have undertaken its post-9/11 torture program. The Senate Intelligence Committee is scheduled to vote today on whether to recommend Haspel's full confirmation at the full Senate. Among the Democrats who have come out backing Haspel is Virginia Senator Mark Warner, the top-ranking Democrat on the Senate Intelligence Committee. At her confirmation hearing last week, Haspel repeatedly refused to call the CIA's post-9/11 treatment of prisoners torture and declined to state whether she believes torture is immoral. But in a letter to the Virginia senator, she admitted the CIA torture program never should have existed in the first place, writing, quote, "While I won't condemn those that made these hard calls, and I have noted the valuable intelligence collected, the program ultimately did damage to our officers and our standing in the world. With the benefit of hindsight and my experience as a senior agency leader, the enhanced interrogation program is not one the CIA should have undertaken," Haspel wrote. Haspel is a 33-year CIA veteran who was responsible for running a secret CIA black site in Thailand in 2002, where at least one prisoner was waterboarded and tortured in other ways during her tenure. She also oversaw the destruction of videotape showing torture at the black site. We'll have more on Gina Haspel later in the broadcast. North Korea has canceled high-level talks with South Korea today in protest of joint U.S.-South Korea military drills currently being staged on the peninsula. The cancellation of today's talks also cast doubt on the proposed summit between President Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un in less than a month. The North Korean state news agency called the U.S.-South Korea Air Force drills deliberate military provocation. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un also directly criticized Trump's national security advisor, John Bolton, for saying North Korea could follow the so-called Libyan model for nuclear abandonment. In a statement issued through the state news agency, Kim called Bolton's idea a, quote, awfully sinister move to impose on our dignified state the destiny of Libya or Iraq, which had been collapsed due to yielding the whole of their countries to big powers, unquote. The joint U.S.-South Korea two-week military drills known as Max Thunder involve fighter jets and aircraft from the U.S. Air Force, Army, Navy, and Marine Corps. North Korea has long claimed the drills are rehearsals for a military invasion. On Tuesday, the White House attempted to downplay the threat that North Korea would cancel the proposed summit between Trump and Kim Jong-un. This is State Department spokesperson Heather Nauert.
We are operating under the idea and the notion that the president's meeting is going forward with Chairman Kim next month.
And if this meeting doesn't happen, will you
that's
still
a hypothetical.
go forward?
That's a hypothetical. You know, look, this news just came out. I can't verify it just yet. It's very early on in the process, but we're planning ahead for our meetings.
The Trump administration's considering plans to hold immigrant children on military bases after they're apprehended crossing the U.S.-Mexico border. The Pentagon says staffers are looking at 3 potential military sites in Texas and 1 in Arkansas. The proposal is the latest signal the Trump administration plans to separate immigrant parents from their children if they're apprehended crossing the border without authorization. In Pakistan, an investigation by Amnesty International has revealed how human rights workers are being targeted by digital attacks aimed at infiltrating their phones and computers, infecting them with malware, stealing their data, and subjecting the human rights workers to intensive surveillance. Amnesty has not determined who's behind the digital attacks against human rights activists in Pakistan. In Mexico, radio journalist Juan Carlos Huerta was shot dead Tuesday morning in the southern state of Tabasco. Mexican authorities say Huerta's killing Tuesday appeared to be related to his work as a journalist. He's the 4th Mexican journalist killed so far this year. His assassination came on the first anniversary of the killing of the acclaimed journalist Javier Valdez last year. The parent company of Fox News has reached a $10 million settlement over a series of racial and gender discrimination lawsuits involving current and former employees of the network. The settlement includes a lawsuit filed by Fox anchor Kelly Wright and other employees alleging, quote, abhorrent, intolerable, unlawful, and hostile racial discrimination. On Tuesday, Wright announced he was leaving the network, and the settlement included a buyout of Wright's contract. The $10 million settlement also resolves multiple gender discrimination lawsuits, including one in which a former reporter for Fox 5 accused former Fox News chair Roger Ailes of sexual harassment and of turning her down for a job because he didn't think she would have sex with him. Uber and Lyft have announced they will no longer require people who are sexually harassed, assaulted, or raped by drivers into forced arbitration, meaning passengers, drivers, and employees of Uber and Lyft can now pursue lawsuits over sexual harassment or sexual assault in court. This new policy also ends the practice of forcing victims into signing confidentiality agreements as part of the arbitration to settle claims. The shift comes after dozens of Uber and Lyft drivers have been accused of sexually harassing, assaulting, and raping passengers. Former Texas Republican Congress member Blake Farenthold says he will not pay taxpayers back after he used $84,000 of public money to settle a 2014 sexual harassment lawsuit with his former communications director, Lauren Green. Green says Farenthold blackballed her from politics when she accused him of sexual harassment, gender discrimination, and creating a hostile work environment. Teachers in North Carolina are walking out of class today and marching on the state capitol in Raleigh as the nationwide teachers' revolt spreads to a sixth state. Hundreds of schools in North Carolina will be closed today as teachers participate in the March for Students and Rally for Respect. Teachers are demanding more funding for education, an increase in the number of school nurses, counselors, and social workers, and a statewide plan to reduce large class sizes and improve crumbling school infrastructure. And Planned Parenthood and the American Civil Liberties Union of Iowa have sued to block Iowa from implementing the harshest anti-abortion law in the nation. The law outlaws abortions once a fetal heartbeat can be detected, something that typically happens just 6 weeks into a pregnancy and before many women even realize they're pregnant. The law is slated to take effect July 1st. This is former Planned Parenthood President Cecile Richards speaking on Democracy Now!
Well, Iowa, of course, as you just reported, I mean, this is one of the most extreme abortion bans in the country. It's clearly unconstitutional. I think the important thing, too, to put it in context, Amy, is that not only are they trying to now ban all abortions, they've actually are trying to end sex education for young people in Iowa. They've shut down Planned Parenthood health centers that served about 12,000 women in the state of Iowa. So this isn't only an attack on abortion rights. It's an attack on affordable reproductive health care for people everywhere.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. The United States is refusing to criticize Israel after Israeli forces shot dead at least 61 unarmed Palestinian protesters taking part in the Great March of Return in Gaza Monday. More than 2,700 Palestinians were injured. At the United Nations, U.S. Ambassador Nikki Haley blocked a call for an international investigation into Israel's actions. On Tuesday, Haley repeatedly blamed the violence on Hamas while praising Israel for showing restraint.
This is what is endangering the people of Gaza. Make no mistake, Hamas is pleased with the results from yesterday. I asked my colleagues here in the Security Council, who among us would accept this type of activity on your border? No one would. No country in this chamber would act with more restraint than Israel has.
During her remarks, Nikki Haley refused to place any blame on Israel. She later walked out of the Security Council chamber when the Palestinian ambassador to the UN, Riyad Mansour, addressed the council. Since Palestinian protests began on March 30th, Israeli forces have killed at least 112 Palestinians and injured more than 12,000. During that time, there have been reports of just one injury to an Israeli soldier. Haley's comments have been widely criticized. On Capitol Hill, Senator Dianne Feinstein said, quote, "I'm deeply disappointed in Ambassador Haley's decision to block a UN inquiry into yesterday's events. Without question, there should be an independent investigation when the lives of so many people are lost." She also criticized President Trump for moving the U.S. Embassy in Israel to Jerusalem.
On Tuesday, the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court said she's closely following the situation in Gaza and would, quote, take any action warranted, unquote, to prosecute crimes. Meanwhile, the United Nations Human Rights Office has condemned the, quote, appalling deadly violence, unquote, by Israeli security forces in Gaza. This is UN human rights spokesperson Rupert Colville.
Lethal force may only be used as a measure of last, not first, resort, and only when there is an immediate threat to life or serious injury. An attempt to approach or crossing or damaging the Green Line fence do not amount to a threat of to life or serious injury and are not sufficient grounds for the use of live ammunition.
To talk more about the crisis in Gaza, we're joined by Norman Finkelstein. His most recent book, Gaza, an inquest into its martyrdom. He's the author of many other books, including The Holocaust Industry, Reflections on the Exploitation of Human Suffering, and Knowing Too Much, Why the American-Jewish Romance with Israel is Coming to an End. Norman Finkelstein is a son of two Holocaust survivors. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Norm.
Thank you for having me.
Talk about what's just happened in the last 2 days, in the last 6 weeks in Gaza.
Well, I'll take off from the comments that you posted now from Nikki Haley and also from Dianne Feinstein. Nikki Haley says that Israel has shown remarkable restraint. So what does the picture look like? About more than 60 Palestinians were killed. About over 1,000, or actually over 2,000, were injured. And what happened on the Israeli side? These demonstrations have now been going on for 6 weeks. Over 100 Palestinians have been killed. Yesterday, or May 14th, Israel announced for the first time there was one, quote, light injury of an Israeli soldier. One soldier, after 6 weeks, apparently incurred a scratch. Now, she says Israel has shown amazing restraint, but all the other witnesses say differently, respected witnesses. Amnesty International, it referred to Israel's murderous assault on overwhelmingly nonviolent protesters. The shadow British Foreign Secretary, Emily Thornberry, who's usually very bad on this issue, she referred to the slaughter that occurred in Gaza on May 14th. So I think at the very least, Nikki Haley is way out of what the most respected and also pro-Israel figures have had to say. Then we turn to Dianne Feinstein, and it is true, her remarks are significant because whereas public opinion has shifted on Israel, Congress has up until now proven to be immobile. But there are significant developments now within the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party on the question of Israel and Palestine, it's changing. And so this is a critical moment because now the critical mass that has been reached in public opinion, it's finally registering in the Democratic Party. And there's one fundamental, well, there are two reasons. One, because Israel is an evangelical Christian state, and that's why it has so much support in the Republican Party and so much support among Trump's followers in particular. And so there's a natural recoiling by the Democratic Party towards the state of Israel because of its allies in the United States. So there has been the shift, and then there's the Bernie base, because the real shift is, whether it was witting or not, the Bernie base of the party is very pro-Palestinian, and that's causing a major shift within the party. So that, too, is a critical development and a positive development. Dianne Feinstein, she called for an investigation. With all due regard, and I wouldn't oppose an investigation, we have to remember there have been many investigations already. There was, after Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9, there was the Goldstone mission. After Operation Protective Edge in 2014, there was the mission led by the New York State Judge, Mary McGowan Davis. And they all recommended that there has to be some action taken. And all of it just died in the UN bureaucracy. So although I don't think Israel should get a free pass, I don't hold out any optimism that even if there were an investigation, it would go anywhere. The same thing with the ICC. I totally support an ICC investigation. But even if finally the chief prosecutor, Fatima Bensouda, even if she did undertake an investigation, at some point it either will die inside the ICC or it will go on interminably.
But, Norma, I wanted to ask you in terms of this particular, what's happened in the past few days, whether this is really a turning point on the scale, let's say, for instance, of what the Sharpeville massacre was in South Africa, in terms of turning world opinion completely against a regime, because the previous attacks by Israel were basically not as visible to the rest of the world on camera as this one was. And secondly, the difference was that in previous attacks, the Israelis were claiming that Hamas was itself attacking Israel. Here you have unarmed protesters basically with slingshots and with Molotov cocktails up against a total military force. And whether you think that this is a turning point in terms of world opinion, being able to continue to ignore what's happening in Gaza and Palestine?
Well, I think that's the critical question. The Sharpeville massacre in 1960, it was nonviolent protesters who were burning their pass cards. And it was about 67 people, if my memory is correct, who were killed. Here again, it was overwhelmingly nonviolent protesters, in this case 62 or 63 who were killed. So it's roughly the same numbers, roughly the same scenario. The important point is it demonstrates the power of nonviolent resistance in mobilizing public opinion. This is not the first time Israel has targeted civilians. In fact, Israel's operations, what it calls its operations, have overwhelmingly targeted civilians. So after Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9, Richard Goldstone, the report, it concludes that Israel's objective was to, quote, punish, humiliate, and terrorize the civilian population. They've always targeted civilians. And in fact, if we were to look, coldly at the facts, in the past 6 weeks, Israel has killed a little over 100 Palestinians. During Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9, on the first day, in the first 5 minutes, Israel killed 300 Palestinian civilians. It was Palestinians who were attending a graduation at the police academy. So, as you point out, and it's a critical point, that the world is now enraged, indignant, outraged at a much lesser, relatively speaking, a much lesser criminality displayed by Israel. Why is that? Well, it's for the reason you already suggested. It's because it was nonviolent, and Israel had no pretext to justify its attacks. And so it was exposed to the world. Israel has said, and it's true, they said, his name just slipped, Amos, I can't remember his last name. He said at one point, it was in the WikiLeaks, he said, we don't do Gandhi well. We don't do Gandhi very well. And it wasn't a facetious remark. His point was, we only have one tool in our box. The one tool is killing civilians. That's our only tool. And you need a pretext to do it. Otherwise, it looks very bad in international public opinion. And so
that was the IDF Major General Amos Gilad.
Amos Gilad, yes. Amos Gilad. And it was true that they need a pretext. And when they don't have, and all along the pretext has been the Hamas rockets, which in fact aren't rockets, they're just enhanced fireworks. But it gave Israel the pretext. And now they don't have the pretext. They've been desperately trying to evoke the pretext. They killed a person close to Hamas in Malaysia. Then they killed 6 Hamas militants about 3 weeks ago. And it was interesting. One of the reasons there were very few demonstrations yesterday, even though May 15th was supposed to be the culmination, it's because Israel sent word through Egypt that if there are those mass nonviolent demonstrations again, we're targeting Hamas's leadership. It was reported in Haaretz and in other places. It's a very interesting fact, because Israel did not target Hamas's leadership during Operation Cast Lead. It did not target Hamas's leadership during Operation Protective Edge in 2014. But it dreads the nonviolent protests because it puts a constraint on the amount of brutality it can inflict. So even though, and it's true, 163 people killed on May 14th, about 2,000 injured, even though those are large numbers, we have to remember they only loom large because it was nonviolent. In the course of Israel's other operations, that's what happens in the morning or in an afternoon on a typical day.
We have to break, and we're going to come back to this discussion. Our guest is the scholar Norm Finkelstein. His latest book is called Gaza, an inquest into its martyrdom. This is Democracy Now! Back with Professor Finkelstein in a minute.
Venezuela, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Mozambique, Costa Rica, Camerún, Congo, Cuba, Somalia, México, República Dominicana, Tanzania, fuera yanqui de América Latina, franceses, ingleses y holandeses, yo te quiero libre. Palestina. الوضع بده الردع صار الوضع بده الردع لكل كثير بتحرر مستوطن بتلمج لكن مصافحة يد ألف كان ألف راق بالهدار الإعلام سلاح مطيب فبركوت أما لما ألمي يدي برجع الواقع كما todos los callados todos los homicidios todos los invisibles todos los callados.
Ana Tijoux and Shaja Mansour here on Democracy Now! I'm Mimi Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, I want to turn to State Department spokesperson Heather Nauert speaking on Tuesday.
But let's go back to something that we have covered extensively here, and let's go back to the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza. We have had many Gazans who have suffered from the loss of medical care, not being able to have access to enough medical care, not having access to consistent electricity, food, jobs, and many other things as well. The misery that is faced by people in Gaza is because of a result of Hamas. That is something that we come back to. People want to blame Israel for all of this that is going on over the past few weeks. Let's take a look at the dire situation that people in Gaza are facing, and that is a result of Hamas's governing.
That was a State Department spokesperson. Norm, people forget that the blockade, how the origins of the existing blockade around Gaza as a result of Israel's reaction to a democratic election that occurred in the Palestinian territories. Could you refresh the viewers' minds about this and who is responsible for the humanitarian crisis in Gaza?
Okay, first of all, as Amira Haas, the respected journalist from Haaretz, pointed out today in the newspaper, the blockade of Gaza in its milder form, but still severe form, it goes back 27 years. It started in 1991 during the First Intifada. The blockade was then significantly qualitatively intensified after the Hamas won the parliamentary elections, what Jimmy Carter, who was an observer, called the completely honest and fair elections in January 2006. The immediate reaction of Israel, followed by the United States and then the EU, was to impose this brutal blockade on Gaza, which at a certain point even prohibited chips, potato chips, baby chicks, chocolate from entering Gaza. And then after Hamas preempted a coup orchestrated by the United States, Israel, and elements of the Palestinian Authority in 2007, Israel ratcheted up the blockade of Gaza. Now, who's responsible for the current crisis in Gaza? First of all, we have to be clear about, let me start with who's responsible. As you are no doubt aware, there's a proliferation of reports from the World Bank, from various UN agencies, UNCTAD, the IMF. They put out report after report after report after report, and there's a consensus. There's a consensus that the proximate cause of the horror in Gaza, the proximate cause is the Israeli blockade. It's not Hamas. There might be some Hamas responsibility, but it's so marginal, so minimal as compared to that blockade. Now, we have to be clear, and I don't want to get too dramatic about it, too emotive about it, but we have to be clear about that blockade. Number one, it's a flagrant violation of international law, because it constitutes a form of collective punishment. Number two, since 2012, the United Nations, and these are very staid, conservative bureaucrats who don't use poetic language. They started in 2012 by issuing a report in the interrogative, will Gaza be livable in 2020? In 2015, UNCTAD issued a report. It then used the declarative. It said on its present trajectory, Gaza will be unlivable in 2020. Now, bear in mind, literally unlivable. These are UN reports by professional economists. By 2017, the UN, Robert Piper, he said we were too optimistic. Gaza passed the unlivability threshold years ago. Gaza, as we speak, it's unlivable. Now, what does that mean concretely? 97% of Gaza's drinking water is contaminated. Now, bear in mind, of the 2 million people in Gaza, 1 million or more, 51%, are children. 1 million or more are children. Sarah Roy, who's the world's leading authority on Gaza's economy, she's at the Harvard Center for Middle Eastern Studies, in the latest edition of her standard work on Gaza's economy, she says, innocent people, most of them young, are slowly being poisoned by the water they drink. Now, Sarah is a very respected, cautious economist, or political economist, as she calls herself. Innocent people, most of them children, are slowly being poisoned. That's what Gaza is today. Now, to get back to Nikki Haley, to get back to Nikki Haley, she said, what country in the world would do anything different to protect their border? Let's be clear. That is not a border, and that is not a border fence. Baruch Kimmerling, the sociologist from Hebrew University, the late sociologist, he said, Gaza is the biggest concentration camp ever to exist. David Cameron, the conservative British Prime Minister, he said, Gaza is an open-air prison. Haaretz, the most respected of Israel's newspapers, referred to the Palestinian ghetto. Israel's snipers are poised not on the border. They're poised on the perimeter. Call it a concentration camp, call it a ghetto, call it an open-air prison. And the people of Gaza, it's unusual in the world today. As the United Nations Relief and Works Agency pointed out, they said Gaza is different than all the other humanitarian crises. Why? If there's a natural disaster like a drought, people move. If there's a human-made disaster like Syria, people move. Gaza is the only place on earth where the place is unlivable and the people can't move. They can't leave. They're trapped. And then that raises for me what's the fundamental question. Even the human rights organizations, which haven't been dead, even they refer to Israel's use of excessive force. They refer to Israel's use of disproportionate force. Implicit in that language is Israel has the right to use proportionate force. Israel has the right to use moderate force. In fact, leaving aside the legalities and the technicalities, let's just look at the picture raw. Israel doesn't have the right to use any force. 2 million people, half of whom are children, are trapped, caged in an unlivable space where they are, to quote Sarah Roy, slowly being poisoned. Unless you believe that Israel has the right to poison 1 million children, it has no right to use any force against the people of Gaza. They have the right to break free from the cage Israel has created for them.
So, Norm Finkelstein, as we begin to wrap up, what do you think is the solution?
Well, there isn't a solution. You know, there's a lot of talk about big solutions. I think what we need to do now, we have to assemble an international team of respected jurists. I would include John Dugard. I would include Alfred de Zayas. I would include James Crawford. These are the top people in international law. And they have to present a plan to end the illegal blockade of Gaza. Now, Israel wants the protests to end. In fact, the people of Gaza, of course, have the right to nonviolently protest. Israel has no right to inflict that blockade. But for the sake of the people of Gaza, then let's just have a quid pro quo. The Gazans will stop demonstrating, but you have to lift that blockade. And I think the plan has to be presented by respected jurists and then garner the support of the leadership in Gaza, which I think they can win, and then from the UN community. In other words, no more investigations. We have had enough investigations. We need now action. And that action means, first and foremost, that illegal, inhuman, immoral blockade of Gaza has to end.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Norm Finkelstein, for joining us. Norman Finkelstein, author and scholar. His most recent book, published earlier this year, is titled Gaza, An Inquest into Its Martyrdom. He's the author of many other books, including The Holocaust Industry, Reflections on the Exploitation of Human Suffering, and Knowing Too Much, Why the American Jewish Romance with Israel is Coming to an End. To see our interviews with him when his book Gaza came out in December, you can go to democracynow.org. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. We'll be back in a minute.
There is power in a band of working folks when we stand hand in hand. That's the power that must rule in every land. One industrial union grand. Have you got that again? You understand the chorus? Everybody got it now? All right. Oh, would you have freedom from wage slavery and come join the grand industrial band? Would you from misery and hunger be free? Come on, do your share, lend a hand. There is power in a band of working folks when we stand hand in hand. That's the power that must rule heaven to fly and start here with a rank on your back. But there is power in a man working folk when we stand hand in hand. That's the power that must rule in every land. One industrial union grand. Oh, if you like sluggers to beat in your head, don't organize, all union despise. If you want nothing before
There's Power in a Union, original by Billy Bragg, this version by Utah Phillips. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, the Senate Intelligence Committee looks poised to endorse President Trump's pick to head the CIA, Gina Haspel, today. This clears the path for her confirmation as CIA director as she gains support from Senate Democrats of Mark Warner of Virginia, Joe Manchin of West Virginia, Joe Donnelly of Indiana, Bill Nelson of Florida, and Heidi Heitkamp of North Dakota. The only Republicans who are not expected to vote for her are Kentucky Senator Rand Paul and Arizona Senator John McCain, a former prisoner of war who is battling stage 4 brain cancer. Haspel is a 33-year CIA veteran who was responsible for running a secret CIA black site in Thailand in 2002, where at least one prisoner was waterboarded and tortured in other ways during her tenure. She also oversaw the destruction of videotapes showing torture at the black site.
At her confirmation hearing last week, Gina Haspel repeatedly refused to call the CIA's post-9/11 treatment of prisoners torture and declined to state whether she believes torture is immoral. But in a Tuesday letter to the ranking Democrat on the Intelligence Committee, Virginia Senator Mark Warner, she admitted the CIA torture program never should have existed in the first place, writing, "While I won't condemn those that make these hard calls, and I have noted the valuable intelligence collected, the program ultimately did damage to our officers and our standing in the world. With the benefit of hindsight and my experience as a senior agency leader, the enhanced interrogation program is not one the CIA should have undertaken," Gina Haspel wrote. Meanwhile, the Senate Intelligence Committee is facing criticism after restricting access to a classified memo prepared by Democrats detailing Haspel's role in advocating for torture and later destroying related evidence. For more, we go to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by Ryan Grimm, Washington bureau chief for The Intercept. His latest piece headlined, "Ahead of Vote on Gina Haspel, Senate Pulls Access to Damning Classified Memo." Ryan, welcome back to Democracy Now! Explain what this memo is all about as the Senate Intelligence Committee is poised to vote to confirm Gina Haspel today or to recommend her to the full Senate to vote.
Well, this was an extraordinary situation where the person who is up for confirmation also is the acting director of the CIA and therefore is in control of what gets declassified. And so what the public can review about her record. And so senators pushed back on the CIA and said, let's at least have, Dan Coates, the director of national intelligence, make the decision on what can be classified or declassified. And the CIA rejected that. The CIA was engaged in an aggressive public relations campaign to get Haspel confirmed. So what the minority staff, the Democratic staff on the Intelligence Committee did is drawing on the classified information that they have access to. They put together roughly a 23-page memo that outlined her role in running the black site, in overseeing and advocating for torture, and her central role in destroying the evidence around that torture. They tried to keep it compact because senators are not known for sitting and reading long reports. Trump gets made fun of for wanting everything to be one page, but there aren't many senators who want more than that. But the problem was it's classified. And so the solution that they had previously was that it was in the basement in this room, it's the Senate security room. And so you, as a senator and a staffer, could go down and review it. As it got closer to the vote on Wednesday, the document was pulled. And staff were restricted from seeing it. At that point, only a senator, without the benefit of their staff, could view it. But they had to request access to it. Under pressure, that was reversed, and some staff were allowed to see it again. But by then, the numbers were in Haspel's favor. And who knows if these senators were even going to read it if you put it on their desk. But people who did read it said that it was an extraordinarily damning account of her tenure and that if you went in undecided, it was very hard to come out and believe that Haspel ought to be confirmed.
And Ryan, it was bad enough her participation in terms of the torture and enhanced interrogation, but the whole issue of her being involved in destruction of the tapes. Could you talk about that, expand on that somewhat?
Yeah, exactly. She was a central driver of, bureaucratically, of this push to destroy these tapes. Sometimes her role is cast as, well, she was asked to do it by her boss, and so why are, and it was approved by the lawyers, so why are we even, putting this on her? In fact, this was one of the things that she was most concerned about at the time. The Bush administration, White House, and let that sink in, and Porter Goss, head of the CIA at the time, were all opposed to the destruction of these tapes. The senior lawyers who were involved with it said, do not destroy these tapes. What Haspel appears to have done is figured out a bureaucratic workaround where she found some low-level attorneys and asked them, does Jose Rodriguez have sole authority on his own to make a decision about what to do with these tapes? And would it be legal for him to destroy these if he decided on his sole authority? And these lawyers said, yeah, I suppose that he has that authority. But she knew at the time that the policy was to preserve this evidence. She went around, those lawyers went around the White House, went around the senior leadership at the CIA, and she and her boss just essentially unilaterally among themselves destroyed the tapes, knowing that once they were destroyed, the only thing that could be done was to ask for forgiveness, which astutely they realized that they would get.
Interestingly, the only thing we're getting around this issue is this whole controversy at the White House now, with the aide saying, it doesn't matter what McCain thinks, he's dying anyway. And President Trump, the White House, no one, including the person herself, is Kelly Sadler, the special assistant to the president, has publicly apologized for this comment. The important quote of the Arizona senator is around the issue of torture, when McCain quoted, Haspel's role in overseeing the use of torture is disturbing, and her refusal to acknowledge torture's immorality is disqualifying, he wrote. But, Ryan, I wanted to end talking to you on a very different issue, the issue of the primaries in Pennsylvania yesterday. 4 Pennsylvania House candidates, backed by Democratic Socialists of America, won their Democratic primaries in Pennsylvania. Summer Lee is a lawyer and labor organizer. Elizabeth Fiedler, a former public radio reporter. Sarah Innamorato is the founder of Women's Advocacy Group, and Kristen Seal works in an energy conservation nonprofit. All 4 female candidates unseated male state representatives in Tuesday's primaries. The significance of this.
This is a huge wake-up call for the Democratic establishment. And one of the defeated Democrats even tried to hustle and run a write-in campaign to win the Republican nomination at the last minute in southwestern Pennsylvania, because there were no Republicans running. It was an unopposed site. And so he thought that, well, if I can get 10 votes or whatever, then I can get this nomination. And that's how desperate the establishment was here to cling to power, that they would do something so disgraceful to them as these longtime Democratic partisans as try to get the Republican ballot. That failed. And out in Omaha, Nebraska, Kara Eastman, with the support of a wide array of progressive groups, but not the support of the more establishmentarian activist groups. She didn't have the pro-choice group. She didn't have a lot of the environmental group support that relies on kind of Washington for some of its political capital. She won anyway. She beat a former Republican who had become a Democratic congressman in a primary in Omaha. And so that race and the others in Pennsylvania will put to the test in November something that the left has always said, that the way to win some of these swing seats is not with a former Republican like Brad Ashford, who sort of still is one and lost in 2016, and you're just going to run him again because you can't think of what else to do. Saying, no, actually, put somebody up who's for a $15 minimum wage, for free college, for Medicare for all, proudly pro-choice, who believes in what she says, and then let voters make a choice between what they have on the ballot. Now we get to see that play out in November.
Ryan Grimm, I want to thank you for being with us. Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for The Intercept. Latest piece we'll link to at democracynow.org ahead of vote on Gina Haspel's Senate polls access to damning classified memo. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report.
Well, we end today's show looking at a new plan by a network of right-wing think tanks to convince members of public sector unions to stop paying dues. Internal documents obtained by The Guardian show the State Policy Network has launched a campaign to, quote, cause public sector unions to experience 5 to 20% declines in membership, costing hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars in dues money. The documents note, quote, this can affect the resources and attention available for union leaders to devote to political action campaigns, end of quote. The effort is backed by $80 million in funding from billionaires like the Koch brothers, who expect a favorable decision from the Supreme Court this month in a case that could let workers who benefit from union-negotiated contracts avoid paying union dues if they opt not to join the union.
The campaign comes amidst major strikes by teachers' unions in West Virginia, Kentucky, Oklahoma, and Arizona. Today, a major walkout in North Carolina, less than a week after a handful of Democrats introduced the Workplace Democracy Act that would repeal anti-union right-to-work laws, streamline union elections, and crack down on employers who punish employees for organizing unions. For more, we're joined in our New York studio by Ed Pilkington, chief reporter for The Guardian in the U.S. His new report, an exclusive look at how right-wing groups wielded a secret toolkit to plot against U.S. unions. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Ed. Lay it out for us.
Well, I think what we're seeing the trade union movement in America at a crossing point, a really crucial and vital moment. On the one hand, we're seeing this surge of activity by unions, as you said, in the teacher strikes right across the country, the latest in North Carolina. On the other hand, they're facing the most existential threat in a generation in the upcoming U.S. Supreme Court ruling Janus, which could gut a lot of their membership, it could gut a lot of their incoming resource, and it could deplete their power as a major cornerstone of the left in America. Now, at this time, at this crucial time, we have obtained a sort of stash of documents from a group called the State Policy Network. They're extremely well funded, as you said, $80 million coming from places like the Koch brothers, the Walmart fortune in their family foundation, the Bradley Foundation from Wisconsin. These are all very well-resourced foundations coming from billionaire backers that are dedicated to introducing low taxes, small government, and to attacking the trade unions. And they fund the State Policy Network, which is a nationwide kind of, I kind of think of it as a spider's web of what they call think tanks. I think of them more as sort of right-wing activist groups. And they are planning and encouraging their members to carry out what they call an opt-out campaign. Now, that's using Supreme Court rules, and it will be using the latest upcoming Supreme Court ruling, which is widely expected to go against the unions, to carry out direct mailing and electronic communication with trade union members. They will contact trade union members directly and encourage them to quit being members of trade unions and also to stop paying their fees and their dues.
And this, in some places like in Washington and Oregon, there's already been efforts, door-to-door campaigns to begin to get people to renounce their union memberships?
Yeah, in Oregon and Washington, one of the members of the State Policy Network, called the Freedom Foundation, which regards itself as a think tank, as I say, it's more like a right-wing activist group, got hold of a list of trade union members in all the public sector unions, and then went door-to-door, knocking on doors, saying, hi, we want you to know that you have the right to stop being a member of your union, and encouraging people to actively quit and to stop paying their money. Now, this could have major consequences for the trade union movements and in a knock-on effect for the whole progressive movement in America, because millions of dollars of resources are at stake and potentially hundreds of thousands of trade union members.
So the strategy document that you obtained at The Guardian from the State Policy Network says, quote, to get employees to opt out of their union, the documents say, they first need to know they have a choice. A direct marketing campaign to union-represented public employees that combines mail and digital outreach helps raise awareness and raise opt-out rates. It continues, access to lists of union members is essential to this project. The most common means of obtaining lists is through requests made under state public records laws, the documents say.
That's right. That's one of the more chilling aspects of this move, I think. They're encouraging their network of members to go out, use freedom of information laws at state level, and by doing that, to obtain the private information of trade union public sector members, notably names, but also addresses, because, as I've said, what they want to do is direct mail or electronically communicate with those trade union members, and to do that, they need the private information. So we're already starting to see that. As we said, we've seen it in Oregon and Washington. There is evidence that other groups are trying to do it elsewhere in the country. Post-Janus, which is the upcoming ruling, which is coming in a matter of days, if it goes against the unions, I would expect to see that kind of activity under freedom of information laws escalate right across the country.
And presumably the reason they're already starting and preparing to act immediately after the Janus decision is to be able to have an impact right away on union power in the upcoming November congressional elections as well.
Right. I think what's really important and interesting about the leaflet, the literature that we obtained, is the terms in which they put it. They're not talking about just giving trade union members First Amendment rights, which is the language they normally use. They're talking about politics. They're quite clear about this. They say if we can reduce the income coming into trade unions, we will therefore be able to reduce the amount of political campaigning and political activity that they can do. So it's a direct assault on the progressive movement in America ahead of November.
And then talk about the Supreme Court decision.
Right, well, this is going to be one of the first major decisions in which Neil Gorsuch will be participating. It comes about because Antonin Scalia actually proposed this kind of legislation, but after he died, it went to a 4-4 kind of deadlock between the two sides of the court, and the previous case called Friedrich actually collapsed as a result. So now that Gorsuch is there, the right-wing networks, the Koch brother-backed groups have re-incited it. It's gone back up to the court under a different plaintiff. It's called Janus now. It's exactly the same case. And we'll probably and almost certainly see Neil Gorsuch go with a 5-4 Conservative majority on the court. And as a result, we'll see a nationwide sweep against trade unions.
Well, when is that expected to be handed down?
It's going to have to be by the end of June, so it could be a matter of any day now.
Ed Pilkington, chief reporter for The Guardian in the U.S., his new report, an exclusive look at how right-wing groups wielded a secret toolkit to plot against U.S. unions. We'll link to it at democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Is accepting applications for our paid video production fellowships as well as a variety of paid internships. Find out more at democracynow.org. I'll be speaking at University of California, Santa Cruz Thursday night. That's May 17th at 7 o'clock with Dan Ellsberg. You can check our website for details at the 910 Multipurpose Room at democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Burke, Renee Feltz, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Laura Gottesdiener, Sam Alkoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Honey Massoud, Trina Nadura, and Nat Needham. Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, and Paul Huckabee are our engineers. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Julie Crosby, Hugh Grand, David Prude, Ariel Boone, Vesta Godars, and Karl Marxer. You can sign up for our daily digest by texting the word Democracy Now! One word to 66866. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Thanks for joining us.